Welcome back. Three South Africans detained for not having work visas in China are back home for Christmas. It's understood they were offered jobs as English teachers, but they weren't provided the correct documents in order to work in the country. eNCA's Khayelihle Khumalo joins us now in studio to discuss this matter. How long exactly were these South Africans detained in the Republic of China?
Well, it's a very protracted issue, Nicholas. So we know that when you go back into June, there was another batch of South Africans, about 51 of them. So now this is another group as well. So about 3 of them returned earlier this morning at the OR Tambo International Airport. So they got job offerings right here in South Africa. They were using the study visa to go to China. So there was an undertaking that once they get to China, the recruitment agency will then provide them with a work visa. So then they got detained by the Chinese authorities. And it was a very agonizing experience from what they were telling us, in terms of the conditions that they were subjected to.
So this very protracted incident of detainment for these 3 South Africans, I mean, did it follow a normal court process? Was it the South African embassy in China trying to secure their release? Was it strictly a diplomatic issue, or did it turn into a criminal one?
Well, Nicholas, as you know, that the Chinese, they have very different system in comparison to what we have. So the parents were saying, look, in South Africa you have a very different law system. In China it's a different beast altogether. So you also had a lot of interventions that was provided by the South African embassy in Beijing. So there was a lot of intervention to try to make sure that these South Africans are brought back home. But we know, Nicholas, one of the main challenges also facing South Africa, you have about 800 South Africans languishing in different jails all over the world. So it's another ongoing challenge for government. So hence, they were able to come and also try so hard in making sure that these particular South Africans are released.
And let's just straighten out the various aspects of the story. The company that promised them a work visa after taking them over there with a study visa, is this a Chinese company or a South African company?
It's a Chinese company, and for some time there has been a lot of warning issued out by recruiters, especially legitimate ones, in terms of making sure that if you're offered a certain job abroad, you've got to make sure that you have your ducks in a row, you do your verification, you make sure that whatever offer that is at hand, it's a proper offer. So now, when we also got an opportunity to speak to one of the parents whose child was part of the 51 first group. So he said to us, there must be a very clear understanding that if you don't have a degree, if you're using a tourist visa or using a visa that is not really legitimate, you cannot work in China. And if you violate the immigration laws, you'll be detained. So I guess, Nicholas, it's still about that issue of trying to bring more awareness programs for the parents, for the children, to have a clear understanding that if you don't have the proper documentation, you cannot leave the country and say you're going to teach in China.
Certainly an interesting to take a viewpoint on as South Africa grapples with issues such as migration and also rampant unemployment among our youth. Do we know at this stage if any action has been taken against this Chinese company, or is this an issue that's going to pop up again because this Chinese company is not being held to account for the wrong that they've done?
In all likelihood, it's bound to be an issue that's going to be popping up again, Nicholas, especially because you have a number of South Africans. So a very interesting issue is about 100 South Africans are right in China. So they've been detained for a number of reasons, others for immigration violation, or others even drug-related issues. So it's something that continues to be a headache for South Africans, especially because we know that the South African government, for example, they've started a program called Travel Smart. As much as it doesn't offer any financial assistance, but they do render consular services in making sure that South Africans who are caught up in any trouble abroad are given assistance.
The argument that the South African-Chinese diplomatic relationship is an unequal one, has there been any assertions from the Chinese that this is an issue that they're going to deal with on that side, or is it basically just left as fair game for Chinese companies, Chinese business people that want to take South Africans over to teach English in that country?
At this rate, Nicholas, it looks like it's only just favoring the Chinese side. But we know that when you look at Pretoria and Beijing, they have very cordial relations. When you look at trade, for example, China remains Pretoria's #1 trading partner. But I suppose when it comes to immigration and the whole migration regime, so this is a very, a huge challenge that two countries will have to look into in terms of how they issue out visas, whether it's a visiting or, just a tourist visa or any visa for that matter. So perhaps it's a new challenge for Foreign Affairs Department to look at how they can thresh out new programs to try and curb some of these issues, some of these issues right in the bud before, it develops further.
Should you expect the same sort of treatment to be meted out to Chinese nationals that are in South Africa? I mean, have you heard of cases of similar issues where Chinese nationals have been detained and then deported as a result of not having their immigration papers in order?
Well, Nicholas, it's a very complex affair because when you look at the issue of rhino poaching, for example, we've seen so many suspects of Chinese descent. So a lot of them here in South Africa, they've always faced a very fair trial. So you'll always have like a normal court process where they will face the music and all the processes being followed. But in this particular incident, when you look at how China, for example, has been whacking around, so when you just hear how some of these teachers were explaining how they were detained and they had their passports taken away from them, so really total freedom just being taken away from you. So a clear violation of human rights. So I think it's an issue that South Africa will have to look at very carefully as to, to make sure that South African nationals are treated fairly as well.
We'll have to leave it at that. It's our senior reporter, Khayelihle Khumalo, talking about this very hot diplomatic issue with some South Africans being detained in China for working without the correct visa, working there as English teachers. Luckily, that's drawn to a close for at least 3 South Africans who've now returned home for Christmas. For now, that's it from me. Coming up next is Madam Speaker with Iman Rapeti.